industrial accidents,
ancient
solving
poisoners,
crime,
poison
chemical
prevention.
spills. This is Toxic History.
Pharmacist Kayla Bourgeois currently practices as a clinical emergency medicine pharmacist in North Carolina. She completed a PGY-1 residency at the University of Maryland Medical Center, followed by a 2-year clinical toxicology and emergency medicine fellowship at the Binghamton University School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences at SUNY Upstate Medical Center.
Welcome. Today we will be exploring the cultural, historical, and scientific journey of the so-called poison apple, including a real one. So I'm here to present Does an Apple a Day Keep the Doctor Away? Folklore, Fact, and the Manchineel Tree. Right. So I have no financial disclosures. I do not own the rights to any movies or any copyrighted material that I use in this presentation. However, I do think this is a great and appropriate time to apologize in advance for any mispronunciations of Latin, French, etc. throughout this presentation. So now on to the objectives. So the apple has a long symbolized temptation and danger, but that's not all. So today we'll explore its journey through lore and reality, common causes of mistaken identity, and how one fruit tree really lives up to the mythology. So where better to start than the very beginning, Genesis. Apples have gotten a bad rap since the Garden of Eden, with Eve being deceived by the serpent and giving the fruit to Adam, and presumably dooming fate for all of humanity. Despite the biblical ambiguity of never naming the actual fruit, it only describes the forbidden fruit as the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. It doesn't help that the Latin word apple is malum, a homonym for the word evil, also malum. And so for those who are as far removed from grade school as I am, homonyms are two words or more having the same spelling or pronunciation, but different meanings. So maybe apples never really stood a chance in the first place. This, paired with visual depictions of the garden during the Renaissance era, continued to back this conclusion. So we have malum with this thing's called a macron over the A, which is specifically referring to the fruit, and then without, meaning evil, misfortune, and calamity. And then the Latin malus means bad, evil, and wicked, which is where we get the English word malice from. And then we have this piece from the Renaissance era from George Frederick Watts entitled Eve Tempted, showing an apple here by the arrow on the left. However, one of the most famous pieces from the Sistine Chapel, entitled Temptation and Expulsion from Paradise by Michelangelo, depicts a fig tree instead. So not everyone had the blame being so apple-centric, as does this piece here, entitled The Temptation of Adam and Eve by Mariotto Albertinelli. So as you can see on the right, have a fig tree versus apples. Now, I know what you're thinking at this point. Probably thinking they can't all be bad apples, right? Just doomed for all of history based on potentially a misnomer. So for all you Marvel fans familiar with Asgard or Norse mythology, Eudun is a goddess who keeps golden apples that grant immortality and eternal youth throughout Asgard. So throughout history, we see that same symbolism of wisdom and potentially knowledge as kind of depicted in some of the Italian Renaissance, but not always tied to the fall of man, which is reassuring, but alternative themes of potentially future happiness, fertility, youth, and even immortality. But on the other hand, in European courts, poison was political. Fruit, especially apples, could be perfectly used as a delivery method, sweet, symbolic, and unsuspecting. So we have families like the Borgias, not to be confused with myself, bourgeois, Spanish, in the Italian Renaissance, who left their mark on history by being known for their various poison attempts and alleged successes disposing of cardinals, bishops, and nobles through what is not exactly known to be the composition of said poison, but they called it cantarella, which was thought to involve arsenic, being the perfect poison due to a lack of flavor, odor, and taste, to be discreet, said to be used in food, wine, and fruit. And then we have Catherine de' Medici of the Italian heritage, the former Queen of France and wife to King Henry II, was also said to be well educated in poisons, likely using fruit as a medium for her doings and dealings. Although this myth has lasted as and association with her, there actually wasn't any conclusive evidence that she used poisonings, despite her vast interest in herbs and alchemy, which is good news for all of us, and was also known for her fascination with perfumed gloves, which led to the belief that she might have laced them with poison. So, aside from apples being used, accused, and abused, we do know apple seeds contain cyanide precursors, such as amygdalin, which must typically be crushed or chewed in very large amounts to do any real damage. But it may have been enough just to keep the myth alive. This fact is often misunderstood, furthering the belief that apples are poisonous. This is not to be confused with what Oppenheimer may or may not have done to the apple that he left for his professor. Of note, there are several other pits containing amygdalin, as well as apricots, almonds, peaches, plums, and cherry seeds, and many others. So here we have vitamin B17, of note, not a real vitamin, also known as amygdalin or laetrile. Historically, amygdalin has been used in traditional Chinese medicine, such as bitter almonds, to remove blood stasis and treat abscesses. Currently, it is not FDA approved, but often found over the counter or in supplements or homemade remedies. And the research is most notable for cancer or use of its antioxidant and anti-inflammatory properties. But again, nothing has been proven. There are cases of fatalities with extreme overdoses secondary to cyanide toxicity. But it doesn't end there. So can you spot the difference? Tomato, tomato. Tomatoes have also received part of the blame over the years. So tomatoes were once called love apples due to their aphrodisiac properties, and was grouped early in the 1500s by herbalists alongside nightshade and the mandrake. And since familiar fruits and vegetables in the Solanaceae family, like peppers, eggplants, ground cherries, were poisonous, thought to contain tropane alkaloids, as was the tomato, and grew the mistrust by association. So we all have probably heard of deadly nightshade, Atropa belladonna, kind of one of those staples of toxicology, meaning beautiful woman in Italian, which alludes to its historical use by women to dilate their pupils, which was considered attractive and seductive. But also, it, in folklore, was suspected to potentially be a key ingredient of flying ointments, which were used by witches to induce a sense of flight. But this was probably due to a way of hallucination. Also, the Roman Emperor Augustus was supposedly poisoned by his wife with deadly nightshade. We have Dionysus, the Greek god of wine and ecstasy, which was allegedly used to induce a trance. And then also in Greek mythology, Atropa refers to one of the three fates as seen in Hercules, responsible for cutting that thread of life. So now back to the tomato. These timelines are extremely interwoven, but it is believed that it wasn't until Spanish conquistadors brought the seeds back from their expeditions in Mexico and Mesoamerica to southern Europe, and even later became known as pomodoro or the golden apple. So, as mentioned, there was confusion to whether the plant was actually even edible or not due to the association with toxic plants. And this information on agriculture was often passed down by previous botanists, no matter what the actual accuracy was. It was kind of what they knew at the time. So, one note also mentioned that the whole plant, the whole tomato, to be of rank and stinking savor. So, if you recognize any of this dinnerware, this too played a part in false suspicions after aristocrats and leaders of nobility were plagued with illness and dropping like flies after consuming tomatoes. However, it was not entirely to blame. The acidity of the tomato on these pewter plates led to a leaching of lead, the element, into meals, causing sickness. So, those in poverty or enslaved individuals would not have likely had access to this dinnerware or utensils, so they were safe. But that didn't stop tomatoes from being avoided for centuries in Europe and colonial America. Insert Chandler. You got the wrong guy. So, the shift from fear to food continued. In the early 1700s, tomatoes made their way to British North American colonies, But the myths of danger still stood strong. Even a century later, legend states this brave gentleman here by the name of Colonel Robert Gibbon Johnson, a proclaimed horticulturist, wanted to prove that, contrary to belief, tomatoes were in fact not poisonous. So, in front of hundreds of townspeople and a small band that he hired, stood on the courthouse steps in Salem, New Jersey, and he ate a poisonous tomato. Now, a physician at the time had predicted, and I quote, "The foolish colonel will foam and froth at the mouth and double over with appendicitis. Should he, by some unlikely chance, serve, his skin will stick to his stomach and cause cancer." End quote. But thankfully, the only thing that died that day was the long held belief that tomatoes were poisonous. So, despite this large display of heroism, even still in certain states, the tomato hornworm still led to kind of the mistrust of tomatoes. So, this green worm here on the left, on top of the tomato, began taking over tomato patches. This worm was described as an object of terror and imparting its poisonous qualities on the fruit that it crawled on. And thankfully, this was dispelled as well, and the tomato could finally beat the allegations and live in peace. So eventually, in the late 1800s, the invention of pizza in Naples made tomatoes gain widespread popularity. Personally thankful for that. As did Joseph A. Campbell, who is the founder of Campbell's Soup, when he found out that tomatoes could last much longer and were kept very well when you can them, and thus the soup was popularized. So the list goes on as more immigrants brought their recipes and culinary expertise over, and to the creation of ketchup, to your favorite personal tomato derivative that we all know and love today. But perhaps the Brothers Grimm, and eventually an arguably more popular Disney adaptation, were right about something. Maybe there is an apple that we should be wary of. So in 2011, the Manchineel tree, also known as Hippomane manzanella, is an evergreen, and it's part of the spurge family, actually cousins to the poinsettias that we see during holiday times. It's found in tropical regions native to the Caribbean, Florida in the United States, Bahamas, Mexico, and Central America, and it got dubbed the world's most dangerous tree. So its name comes from the manzanilla, meaning little apple in Spanish, due to its resemblance, which we'll see on the next slide. And also of note, the spurge family actually got its name from purge because many of them can be used for laxatives, which leads us into its toxicity. So these small green apple-like fruits, should you take a bite, would start off sweet, but soon turn peppery as they are extremely toxic. So they contain phorbol esters and other irritants, which cause intense burning, throat tightness, vomiting, and potentially long-term damage to the gut if ingested. And then there's a white milky sap, which you can see here hopefully in the bark, but it also can come from the apples. It can cause blistering and temporary blindness if you come into contact with the eyes. Additionally, if you thought to seek shelter underneath this tree or incidentally stumbled upon it during a humid Florida evening, could result in an acid rain or acid condensation, if you will, type picture, leading to chemical burns on the skin. And then there are even some horror stories out there about people mistakenly using the leaves to wipe after using the restroom. So every part of this tree is toxic, even down to the roots. So speaking of demise, though I found no records of modern deaths from the Manchineel, the Spanish explorer Ponce de Leon led European expeditions in search for gold, expansion, and the Fountain of Youth, and thought to have discovered Florida, which is where it gets its name for being flowery and floral and full of lush vegetation. Amidst traveling back to Puerto Rico to protect his secured wealth and land, he eventually returned back to Florida, where the native Calusa warriors fought to protect their own homeland, and Ponce de Leon was thought to be wounded by an arrow to the thigh, laced with the sap of the Manchineel. So his demise would have likely been due to blistering and like an unhealing wound, leading to infection, and then sepsis, and ultimately death. So if you see any warning signs on the beach or near the trees, please take heed as they are very, very serious. So just to kind of read one out, warning Manchineel tree, leaves, bark, and fruits of these trees contain a caustic sap, which may be injurious If touched, Columbus described the small green fruits as death apples, and the trees are common along the Caribbean shores. So, from what I saw, the natives or parks or what have you are pretty good about putting up warning signs, either them looking like this or kind of painting a red circle around the tree just as a warning. So you may be thinking, if it's so dangerous, why don't we get rid of it? And what all these cute animals in this tree have in common is that they're on the endangered species list. So even if it wasn't on the endangered list, clearing it from the Everglades would be a huge detriment as it's very pertinent to fighting coastal erosion. So it has big, deep roots that are helping us out in that aspect. And so, despite the number of animals that can actually ingest it and spread the seed without harm, thankfully, the apples are very buoyant and can travel down the coast and sprout and keep and protect us from all washing away. So, additionally, typically the method of clearing trees out is by fire, which would result in a pretty massive toxicity because even the smoke is harmful and may lead to blindness, dermal, or inhalational injury if aerosolized. But fun fact, though most mammals generally have poor time with the fruit, these animals do not. The Galapagos tortoise and iguanas are immune to the fruit's effects. So, but they're not native to Florida. But if you happen to stumble across some free bark and are bold enough to go through the process of drying and detoxifying it, I'm told the wood is great for furniture. So to close, now that we've taken a stroll through time, many fruits were feared, but only maybe one truly deserves the title. So the Manchineel shows that myth and nature often intertwine, but I'll leave it to you to decide if an apple a day is worth it, and I hope you enjoyed my talk today.